Anyway, we're going to be talking today about really one of the most central, maybe the most central figure in modern ethics, Immanuel Kant. Kant was a Prussian philosopher writing right near the end of the 18th century, so as you might say the high point of the European Enlightenment. In fact, he wrote a famous essay called What is Enlightenment? He was kind of a remarkable character in his own right. He never traveled more than 10 miles from the place of his birth. He was from Königsberg, which is this little city sort of on the north tip of Poland. It is still officially part of Russia, but at the time it was a city in Prussia. He hung around the University of Königsberg teaching informal classes really for most of his career until he became famous enough that they named him professor. But most of the time he wasn't actually even officially on the faculty. In any case, he's somebody who, well, I should say he was known for giving great dinner parties, at which there was much wine, it is said, many jokes. He never married, and in fact, at one point, his manservant showed up in a bright yellow jacket. And Kant is reputed to have said, "Why are you dressed so garishly?" And he said, "It's because later today I'm going to be married." And Kant actually physically attacked him. And was going to beat him up for getting married. Anyway, Kant's ethics is immensely influential, and it's based on the idea of reason. He thinks that reason is really all you need to generate all of ethics. He gives us, in the work called The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, 5 different principles, all of which he claims to be equivalent. And so what we're going to do is take a look at a few of those that are the most influential and the most important. The general structure really is he gives you a general consideration about what he thinks is most important in ethics, and then he develops version 1 of the principle, then tries to argue that that implies version 2, version 3, version 4, version 5, and then that implies version 1 again. And so we go in this big circle, which he thinks establishes the equivalence of all of these. Now, the general idea is really that, you might say, right actions are rational actions. Wrong actions are in some sense irrational. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else is having the same problem, but just I can't pull the statue.
I tried to look down.
I got it.
I've got gray.
It takes a while.
Oh, yeah, it's a big file because I've got some images.
Okay. So just take some time.
Yeah, be patient, it will work.
Apparently it's not going to work, so I'm
No,
gonna try to-
that's fine, it doesn't. All right,
It's too disruptive at this point. It's up to you if you want to
yeah, I mean.
take some time to get it up there, we can. Because we could try if somebody's.
It really doesn't, I mean, it really doesn't matter. Maybe it'll go faster if I don't show you all these slides, actually. So maybe that's an advantage. Anyway, let me remind you of the distinction Aristotle draws between instrumental and intrinsic goods. An instrumental good is good for the sake of something else. An intrinsic good is something good for its own sake. And so we talked about some things that are instrumental goods. Things good purely for the sake of something else. You wouldn't want it for its own sake, it's purely a means to something else. So we talked about some of the things that are means to other things. We did this very briefly, as I recall. I did Aristotle in 7 minutes. But what are some things that we desire only for the sake of something else?
Artwork.
Artwork. And what would
I'm
be?
sorry, hard work.
Hard work. Oh yes. Okay. Good. Hard work. Yes. That's something you might say. Do you just enjoy working hard for its own sake? I mean, maybe, but most people use hard work as something that achieves an end. It's good as a means, but not something to be desired necessarily for its own sake. Other things that are desired purely for the sake of something else. Well, how about a cell phone, right? It's good for various things, but it would be odd to say, oh, you know, what do you use your cell phone for? Is it mostly for making calls, for texting, for playing games? And you say, I don't really use it for anything. I just value cell phones for their own sake. No, they're tools, right? All tools, all instruments are like this. Now, what are some things that are good for their own sake? They would be desirable whether they were good for anything else or not.
We talked about happiness, right?
Yes, happiness is one of those things, right? We don't say, what is happiness good for? We instead think happiness is something desirable for its own sake. there might be lots of things like this, right? Maybe pleasure is desirable for its own sake, or honor, or self-esteem, or respect, or love. And there are lots and lots of things we might think of in these sorts of ways. Now, Aristotle says happiness is the one thing that is always good for its own sake, never for the sake of something else. But now Kant starts with a distinction that is very similar to this. Not exactly the same distinction, though. He distinguishes things that are good with qualification, okay, qualified goods, you could say, from goods that are good without qualification. So, what would be an example of a qualified good? Well, it's good under a particular circumstance if you have a certain desire. It's good under certain conditions. It's good if such and such holds, okay? So, most instrumental goods that Aristotle talks about are qualified goods. A cell phone is good if you have a certain desire or a certain task you want to perform with it. It's not so good if you don't have that desire. Other examples of things like this, they're good only under certain circumstances, but not just good across the board.
Go back to love. I mean,
Yeah, okay. Love, yeah. Well, love, is it good under any circumstances or good only under special circumstances?
Reciprocated is okay, but what if it's not reciprocated?
Ooh, yeah, all right, interesting, yeah. So you might think, look, love is a good thing if the other person loves you back, for example, but it might not be a good thing. Gosh, Somerset Maugham's novel of Human Bondage is an example of someone who's desperately in love with somebody who doesn't care about them and the torment that that causes somebody. So you might think, yeah, love is something good and very good under certain circumstances, but maybe not so good under others. Now that tells us something really important, because love would probably count as something Aristotle would consider an intrinsic good, good for its own sake. But it's not really good without qualification. It's not good under every single possible circumstance. And so that tells us Kant's distinction is different. It's really much more limiting in a way than Aristotle's, because lots of those things that are good under certain, well, are good for their own sake, are only good under certain circumstances. Think about some of the other possibilities. We mentioned pleasure. Is pleasure something that is always good? Good under every circumstances, no matter what? No. I'll leave it to your imagination. What might be circumstances where it's not? But a super simple one, right? I am on a diet, and I purposely did not look around for snacks because I sort of thought, okay, bad, right? 2% for pleasure. So I want to avoid that. So that's one thing. Now, if we start thinking about other things, Kant says, we're going to find out that all of those things that are on Aristotle's list of intrinsic goods are actually not good without qualification. So he begins by thinking about some of the possibilities and come back to what he does think is good, but he begins this list. He says intelligence, wit, judgment, and the other talents of the mind. Now he's talking about there what Aristotle would call intellectual virtues. And are they good under any circumstances at all? Is intelligence, for example, good no matter what? No. When would it be bad to be smart?
Let's use darn.
There.
When it's used for evil.
When it's used for evil. Okay, good. So the evil genius, the person who is, let's say, a criminal mastermind, their intelligence is not a good thing. It might be good for them in achieving their criminal aims, but it's not, in general, a good thing. Other examples of it.
Who defines that?
Yeah.
Because that evil person, I mean, we've seen this in the past where this is the good and right thing to do, where everybody else is saying, no, this is genocide, this is this, that, and the other.
Right.
But one side is saying, no, this is the good and the right, when, so who's
And
fine?
is their intelligence, is it their intelligence that is
Right.
the bad?
Yeah, okay, good. Kant at one point considers that, actually. And he says, okay, is a murderer, is a thief, somebody who is playing by a different set of rules and has a different conception of the good? And his answer is no. And here's how you can tell. Would the murderer be willing to be murdered? Would the thief be willing to be robbed? And the answer is no, right? And so Kant says that's a sign that the murderer doesn't actually think murdering is good. The murderer is just thinking he can make an exception for himself to these rules. And the same thing with a thief. The thief doesn't really say, oh, I think it's okay to rob, I've got a different set of values. No, they're just cheating on a set of values that they actually share with you. If you stole from a thief and they just said, hey,
Easy come, easy go.
easy come, easy go, I'm cool with that, I think it's cool to steal from it, then it would be different. But Kant says that's not what murderers and thieves are like. So he does anticipate that point, and that's at least his argument. Now, I don't know if that really works. There might be some criminals who are actually like that, and there might be others, even if it's not murder or theft, where actually somebody would be willing to play by a totally different set of rules. So I think we need to be careful with that. It's maybe too quick an answer. But still, at least he thinks that's some answer. Other cases where intelligence would be a bad thing.
When it negatively affects your happiness.
Good, when it negatively affects your happiness. I have known some people who were unbelievably smart. And some of those people really seem miserable. I mean, they're weird, right? Maybe you had a kid in your high school who had the perfect SAT scores and everything and ended up going to MIT, but always sat alone in the cafeteria looking somber and, was really probably semi-autistic and so forth. Maybe that's independent of that person's intelligence, but maybe actually tremendous intelligence at some level makes you miserable. The other example I kind of came up with, a case where intelligence is bad. I think junior high school, it's like my junior high school. Anyway, got you in lots of trouble, got you beat up. So anyway, intelligence is not always a good thing. What about wit? That's another example he gives of an intellectual virtue. Is it always good to be witty?
No.
No. Exactly, you can get in trouble a lot. In that one semester I taught junior high school, I had a student who was very, very witty, very funny, and he was failing all his classes. The teachers hated this. But I started laughing at his jokes. He was really funny. He was really witty. However, Now, what about other things? He says courage, perseverance, other moral virtues. Aristotle would have thought moral virtue is something that is good for its own sake. It's good for its own sake to be honest. Now, honesty, for example, is something that will bring you other benefits too. So it's an example of something that's good for its own sake and good for the sake of something else. But Kant says, well, is it an unqualified good? Is it always a good thing to be honest?
No.
No. Like when?
That is an ugly dress.
All right, good.
Fat.
Yeah. Okay, that's an ugly dress. Or wow, you look fat. Or, how am I doing? Oh, terribly. Or the student who comes to my office and says, what can I do to improve my paper? And, the honest answer would be burn it.
Answer the question.
So yeah, I mean, honesty is not always a good thing. What about courage? Is courage always a good thing?
Yeah.
No.
Now, why not? What would be an example of a case where courage was not a good thing?
Jump off.
Telling your wife she's fat.
All right, that might be an example, right? Now, Aristotle would say, well, wait a minute, by courage, I mean the mean, right? I don't mean going so far that you become reckless or rash or anything like that. So Aristotle at least would say, admittedly, you could be too courageous in some situations. But I think Kant is trying to say, even when you achieve the mean, and we'd really call it courage and not recklessness, there could be occasions where that's not a good thing. When, for example, you're trying to do something bad, and you're brave enough to do it. It really is bravery, but you're doing something bad. It takes courage, maybe, to rob a bank, but that courage isn't a good thing. Or, actually, an example that came to my mind was the September 11th attacks. A number of people at the time described those attacks as cowardly. And I remember talking to my brother, saying, that's obviously not true. I mean, think about it. Commandeering an airplane, flying it into a building, that's something that would take real courage. Now, it's a terribly evil act. It's not denying the evil act. But, if you're going to have terrorists, do you want them to be courageous, or would you rather have frightened terrorists who are afraid to do anything about it? I'd rather have terrorists who are utter chickens than have terrorists who are great. The courage of a terrorist. It's not a good thing. Yeah.
But isn't the word courage a positive thing in the first place? So if they're doing that, it's not really courage, it's something else maybe?
So that may have
Ooh. All right, good. That's an excellent point. Remember, we talked a little bit about, but not too much about, that distinction between Plato and Aristotle. Really, I should say Socrates in that early stage of Aristotle, where Socrates thinks all the virtues come to the same thing. And if you have that sort of Socratic view, then you're absolutely right. You can't be courageous in an evil cause, because the evil cause shows you don't know good from evil, you don't know right from wrong. And so you can't be courageous, because that involves knowing right from wrong in this particular situation. Aristotle, I think, would say, but wait, all these virtues aren't the same thing. I can imagine somebody who's courageous but really unwise, for example, or courageous but very stingy, or courageous but mean. And so he thinks they don't come to the same thing. But if you were more inclined towards Socrates' view, then you're right. And in fact, one of the things that divides Aristotle and Socrates is that question of whether all of those virtues combined, could you be courageous or generous or something in an evil cause? And I think it's a little hard to say. I mean, my own inclinations are to Aristotle's side here and thinking that they're separate questions, but I don't think it's easy, because there is something appealing about the thought that really, look, if you're fighting for the wrong side in a war, let's say, maybe there is something important that you don't know, at least if it's something that you really ought to know. You aren't actually able to see the goods and the evils, the dangers and the benefits, and compare them properly. And if you can't, then can you really be courageous? So anyway, I think it's a hard question.
But I guess if the reason why they're doing it is for a good, then I guess if you do believe, support the Socrates view, then it is courageous. Like, I think sometimes we don't always look at why they did the 9/11 attack. We look at it as, oh, that's evil, versus maybe it was for, a greater good.
Well, that in a way brings us back to your point, right?
Let's maybe something a little bit more realistic. Did you read All Quiet on the Western Front?
No, heard of it though.
So
Maybe-
World War I soldiers, but they're on the German side, and these guys are they're in the foxhole, well, they're in the trenches with their buddies. They're fighting side by side. They're fighting the good fight, or at least what they think it is. So they're displaying very large acts of courage, things like that, because they're facing insurmountable odds and tough enemy, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, they're still the German army. They're still the axis of evil, or the predecessors to that. But us defining that act because they're part of the Axis power, why are they not courageous, even though they're still fighting for their families, they're still fighting for their land, they're still fighting for their people. So the fact that these 9/11 terrorists, they're effectively doing the same thing, it's just a more contemporary frame, different kind of conflict.
Right.
So we can't just say that what they're doing is not necessarily courageous, it's just
Right.
that
I agree.
we were the victims.
Right.
Yeah, we've got to be careful about that question of what sort of the ultimate good is. Now, Aristotle would say, well, that one thing that's a really final good is happiness, so that would be a way of judging. But what about happiness itself? Is happiness good under every possible circumstance? Or is it only good if certain conditions are fulfilled? Can you think of a case where happiness seems like a bad thing?
Yes. When the
Like what?
Just kind of like what we're talking about, like if it's happy for one side, but not for the other side, then is it happy, it's not as good.
Oh, okay, all right, good. The happiness of somebody engaged in evil, from our point of view, right, doesn't seem like a good thing at all. Imagine a movie where in the end, the bad guys win, and the bad guys are happy, and prosperous, and get the girl, and the good guys all die. I think this is like a Quentin Tarantino movie. But anyway, in a movie like that, you might think, wait a minute, their happiness isn't a good thing. And so Kant gives us exactly that example. He says, look, the happiness of somebody who is endowed with no aspect of a pure and good will would never give pleasure to an impartial, rational spectator. And that becomes a key test for Kant. Imagine yourself as an impartial spectator on something. Would you approve of the happiness of that character? In fact, Kant goes on to say, what really matters isn't happiness from a moral point of view, it's being worthy of happiness, being somebody who deserves to be happy. If somebody is really wicked and in the end is happy, we don't feel good about that. We don't think that's a moral good, at any rate. It might be good for that person, but we don't think it's good, right? Conversely, if somebody is really good and then they suffer, we think that's bad. That person deserves happiness and they're not getting it. So he says it's not really happiness that matters from a moral point of view. It's deserving to be happy, being worthy of happiness. Well, all of that raises the question, well, if not any of those things that Aristotle would have thought of as intrinsic goods, then what would be good without qualification? Good under any possible circumstance? Kant says there's one thing in the world, or even out of it, he says, even beyond the world, that is good without qualification, and that is a good will. Okay? Now, what does it mean to have a good will?
It means your intentions were good.
All right, one way of looking at this is to say it means your intentions are good. And indeed, I think Kant's test, and we're going to see various versions of it, but it all comes down to testing your intentions. Testing what he calls the maxim of your action, the principle and the basis of which you're acting. And that comes down to pretty much, I think, your intentions for acting. So we evaluate your intentions. And so a person of goodwill is somebody with good intentions. Now, what does it mean to have a good intention?
You want good for others. You want what's best for
All
the
involved,
greater
yeah.
good. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, there are a number of different ways we could take this, I think.
And
And
that
Kant,
still could end up being bad for other
Kant
people.
takes it in one,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Good intentions are subjective, though. I mean,
Yes, they are.
it's as subjective as everything else, isn't it?
I agree.
Well,
What's good for my intentions might not be good for your intentions.
he's going to try to get objective laws of morality out of this, but you're right, he starts in a very subjective place. We're starting with the will, right, with intentions, with things in here, so completely subjective. And then it's a question of, well, what is that like? Is it good? And then we have to figure out what good is. But you're right, we start in a subjective place. And in a way, the difficulty, there are two things about his project that are really difficult philosophically. One is he's trying to get us from the subjective to the objective. He wants objective laws of morality, not just what seems moral to you. But he's starting in a totally subjective place. And that's tricky. And the second thing really tricky is when he says nothing in this world or even out of it is good without qualification except a good will. What he's really meaning is he's looking for necessary laws of morality. In that respect, he's much more ambitious than Aristotle, or I think the other Greek philosophers. They're looking at what is good for human beings. What is the good for mankind is the kind of question they ask, and they try to give an answer. Kant says, forget mankind. I'm talking about what is good for any being that is a rational agent at all. For anybody who makes decisions. Anybody who is actually facing an issue where they have to decide. It might be a human being, it might be some other kind of being. Now, you might think, well, that's strange. I mean, he hadn't even watched Star Trek, right? So how did he get this idea? Partly he's concerned with the angels. Partly he is concerned with applying this so broadly that, why? It's really a question of trying to find something necessary. He doesn't want to look at human psychology and say, all right, the way human beings are constituted, we care about happiness, for example, or we care about love, or we crave food, or he's trying to get something much more general than that. Something that would apply to beings who choose, even if they didn't share those characteristics in us. Now, he thinks if he can get necessary and universal principles like that would apply to any being making any choices at all, then if you tell him the facts about human beings, he'll be able to deduce more specific laws of morality. But he's after something that, in a way, is much bigger. So he's not going to just look around at human beings and say, so what do you want out of life? What do you want out of life? And so on. It's a much bigger game. He's trying to say, I want to think about what it is to be rational, to make choices, and get objective laws of morality out of just that. Well, how do we do that? We start thinking, well, okay, what is a good will? And you've given us one account. It's to want the best for other people. And I think that's a very plausible account. A person of goodwill wants to benefit other people, right? They want other people to be better off. That, it turns out, is not Kant's strategy, but it strikes me as a very plausible strategy. So I think a lot of philosophers could start this way, come up to this point, and then go in that direction with it. He doesn't go in that direction, but it's actually way more plausible in my own view than the direction he goes. What other things? Maybe it's easier to back into this. Think about somebody who does not have a good will. Somebody who has a bad will. Okay? You might say they seek harm to other people. That would be the flip side of your consideration. But what else could we say about that? What are other things that would indicate a bad will?
They want to treat other people as a means to an end.
Okay, good. I see you did the reading. Yes, they want to use people. They want to treat people as a means to an end. And so a key way of thinking about one of his criteria, something he calls the formula of humanity, or actually that scholars call the formula of humanity. I suppose he doesn't call it that exactly. But it's one that says that's the fundamental principle of morality. You may not use other people. Treat everyone as an end in him or herself, not as a means only. Okay? And now, so a person of bad will just uses other people and merely uses them. He wants to distinguish merely using somebody from using them in a way that would be morally okay. So what would it mean to treat somebody as a mere means, as opposed to treating them as a means, but also respecting their basic humanity? Think about a case where you use someone for an end, but it doesn't seem immoral.
Well, I have projects at my work, and I have people who are on my team, and they run with projects or set things up or whatever. I mean, I'm using them for
Right.
their job. I mean,
Exactly. You're using those other teammates at work to get work done. Your employer is using you.
That's right.
You're using people who work for you to accomplish tasks and so on. Now, is that bad? I mean, we could take this in a direction and say, yes, it's all exploitation, it's all terrible, and so on. But that's not the way Kant takes it. Kant thinks that's fine, as long as they're consenting to this, as long as they're part of this arrangement and so forth, then that's okay. However, merely using somebody as a means would be not respecting their basic humanity. So one way I like to point this out is suppose you've got somebody who's a coworker and you're saying, all right, you do this part, I do that part. And then, as you're talking about this and you're both starting to work, they collapse, okay? They just, let's say, grab their left arm and fall over on the ground. Now, what would the person who respects their basic humanity do?
call 911.
Call 911, yeah. Do something
Step
smart.
on them.
Yeah.
What would the person who's merely using them as a means do?
Step over.
Call anyone.
Okay.
Call someone else and finish the job.
Yeah, I mean, you might say, look,
Borrow
to
their
just,
cell phone to surf webs.
right, or, yeah, well, I mean, yes, they would not respond to respecting their basic humanity, right? That person would surely want you to get help or provide help yourself or something. But if you just ignore it or just, kick them and say, come on, man, do your part. Or what happens these days is you whip out your cell phone and start filming, right? Oh, coworker's dying. There was somebody not long ago, actually, wasn't it a case in Florida of a disabled person who fell into this
Yes.
ravine, and these people just filmed the guy drowning.
Yeah.
Nobody helped him.
Oh,
So anyway, yeah, I mean, that is using somebody as a mere means. Now, I think Kant's making a distinction that's important for workplaces and for organizations. So let's talk for a minute about this. You're supposed to treat everybody else as an end in themselves. Another way to put this positively is to respect people, okay? And I don't mean respect here in the sense of value their contributions or anything like that. You might think that a person is really utterly useless at work. Nevertheless, you might respect their humanity. My daughter told me about going into the bathroom this week at work and finding a coworker fast asleep and snoring loudly. And apparently this person does this quite frequently. You might not respect that person's work output, right? But nevertheless, Kant says, you owe them a basic level of respect as a human being. You respect their rationality to a certain degree. Now, what would that mean in the workplace? What kinds of requirements are going to be imposed by the fact that you have to treat people with respect as ends in themselves and not merely use them? Of course, the workplace is using people for what they can do all the time, and that's not the problematic part. The problematic part is that disrespect for their basic humanity. So what kinds of ethical principles, ethical rules, ethical considerations would we bring in to try to guarantee that everybody treats everybody else with some level
Can you go
of
back
basic
to the
respect?
example
Yeah.
of finding somebody asleep at work? So.
Yeah. Okay, good.
So, respecting their basic needs means that you have goodwill, but what does respecting their basic human needs in the workplace mean? Does it mean that, well, they're sleeping, I don't know if it's because they have a newborn at home, or maybe they're working 2 jobs, or so just let them sleep, or does that mean that maybe the right thing by the organization, and
Right.
Go tell somebody.
All right, that's a really good question. What should you do?
Maybe wake them up and just
Wake them up and,
help them, not turn them in.
yeah,
Just try to
don't take a
help
picture of them and
along.
post it while they're sleeping. Instead, wake them up and maybe ask if
But
they
then
can help.
the other question comes into play, what if you're their coworker, but what if you're their boss, or
Yeah.
what if you're their employee? So you have different levels there as
Also, you
well.
now have
Right.
additional information that this happens quite frequently.
But you
Yes.
don't know why.
Right, now if this happens frequently,
But you
that's
don't know
additional
why.
information.
Yeah.
But, right, let's go back to let's imagine this is the first time this has happened, right? In fact, imagine better that you don't really have any background information at all about this. You're a new employee, and you walk into the ladies' room. Well, let me not, I mean, in her case, it was the ladies' room, but maybe we should get rid of that aspect of it. You walk into the appropriate bathroom, okay?
Ginger neutral room.
Yes, right, and there is someone actually asleep. Now, what should you do, actually, in response to that? We can easily say what you shouldn't do, right? I mean, one thing is snap photographs of them and start plastering the walls of the building with them and so on. But what would you do? Let's start with this question of your,
Yeah.
Sugar, okay.
Not if they're
Injured or
snoring.
well,
hurt.
yeah, right. I mean, one thing is to make sure they're okay. The snoring is some evidence they're not, dead, but still, they could be unconscious and snoring, I suppose.
Yeah.
Could be narcoleptic.
Could be narcoleptic, yeah. Now, suppose you're that person's boss. What should you do?
I think your initial to still make sure they're okay is the same, but then you may have to decide whether it's disciplinary or not. I mean, if they're on their lunch break and they're asleep in the bathroom, then
Yeah, I agree.
That's true.
Are they like
They're
curled
great,
up
they're
with
great,
a
yeah.
blanket? Are they prepared for this, or was this?
Are they prepared?
Will they swallow?
No, that's actually a very good point. I mean, is this like, hey, I brought my pillow and I'm,
Was
and
it a couch or was it? Because I used to actually go into the stall during college in my work and sleep on the stall.
oh, I see.
But I wasn't prepared. But
At my place of employment, some of our event days are 22 hours long.
yeah.
So it's not unreasonable for
Right.
someone to be asleep for 15 or 20 minutes on their break. But when that happens, I usually kind of like see what time, like try to take the context of the day into consideration. If it's like their lunch break, if they brought a pillow, if they've done their job. I mean, if you had one project for the day and you finished it in the first hour, then why not just sleep for the next 7?
Well, notice what you're all saying. You're all saying, I have to understand what that person's aims are, right? What's actually going on here? What are they? For example, if it's like, I've been working for 22 hours straight and I'm exhausted, or the baby kept me up all night, or whatever, you have to sort of find out what's going on. You have to figure out what the purpose, in a sense, of this is. Is it to catch up from sleep? Is it sort of like, look, nobody ever checks, so I figure I can just get away with this? Or, is there some other kind of problem? In short, you try to look at the ends that person has in mind, and also this particular means to those ends. It might be that you have to talk to somebody and say, well, look, maybe there's another way of solving this problem, if it's starting to interfere with their work, or maybe you find out it's not interfering, maybe it is over their lunch hour and all of this. Or it could be another kind of case. I mean, one of my colleagues years ago was working on a project. He was working very late into the night. He was living in a house with a guy who was visiting from Germany for the semester. And so the two of them were sharing this rental house. And this young guy from Germany walked into the bathroom in the middle of the night. He woke up at 3 in the morning or something, had to go to the bathroom, walked into the bathroom, and there was my colleague with his pants down, as if he had been on the toilet, just lying on his floor. And so he suddenly thought to himself, oh my God, Hans is dead. Went rushing over and shook him. Well, Hans had just been so tired from working on this project that he had been just sitting on the toilet and fallen asleep, and falling had not woken him up. And now, we're professors, we can get away with anything, so it's not really like, but still, if that happened in the workplace, maybe somebody's been working so hard, they just collapsed and are so exhausted, etc. So you really have to find out the story, right? And I think that tells us something important about rationality. What is it to respect somebody else's and end in themselves? It's to think, look, as a rational agent, here's what I'm doing. I am using means to attain certain ends. Now, Kant will say there are certain ends that it's rational for a rational being to have. Others might be irrational. So we care about the rationality of the ends as well as the rationality of the means. But for me to respect you as a rational being is to think about the rationality of your ends and the rationality of your means. And so, indeed, to say, what are the circumstances here? Why is this person asleep here? And so on. All of that would be part of respecting them as a rational agent. I have to know what they're doing. And I don't mean sleeping. I mean, what their goal is here, what kind of means this is, what's the bigger picture. And that involves evaluating them as a rational agent. So, what are some things that a rational agent will naturally and rationally value? There might be a bunch of things, but Kant says the most fundamental thing, and I think this is a key premise from which a lot of the rest of his ethics follows. A rational being will necessarily value their own rationality. Okay? What is it to be a rational being? It's to make choices in pursuit of goals. So I am going to value, as a rational being, my own ability to make choices to attain my goals. Anything that interferes with that, I'm naturally, it would be irrational for me to want. So I value my own rationality. I value my own ability to attain certain ends by making choices. And it's rational for me to value that ability, in fact, to try to develop that ability. It would be irrational for me to destroy that ability. So what are some things that it might be irrational for me to do? I value my own ability to attain certain goals by choosing among means. And so if I value that ability, what should I do? What should I value? And what shouldn't I value? What would get in the way of that?
So I think you're assuming that everyone's, the definition of rational, right, is the same for everyone?
Yeah.
Is that true, right?
Well, exactly. That's what he thinks. Rationality is a matter of pursuing goals by choosing among means.
Yeah.
And so that's the same for everybody.
Right.
People might have very different means that they've selected and very different goals they're trying to pursue. But nevertheless, they're all rational beings in the sense that they're beings making choices to try to pursue those goals. That's something we all have in common. And not just human beings, any rational being has that in common. And so now, I'm going to value that rational ability. And now, it's crucial that I do it not just for myself, but for everybody else too. I value rationality. And I've got to respect your rationality too. So I don't just value my own ability to attain my ends. I've got to value your ability to attain your ends. I've got to value your rationality too. So I can't do anything that would interfere with my rational pursuit of my own aims. I can't do anything that would interfere with your rational pursuit of your aims. Okay? And in that way harm your rationality. So what's a way in which somebody might interfere with your ability to choose among means to pursue your own ends?
Give you misleading information.
Good, give you misleading information. Somebody might deceive you. That would be clearly wrong because it interferes with your ability to pursue your own goals. If somebody lies to you, if somebody tricks you, deceives you, then they are actually interfering with your rationality. They're making it difficult for you to actually pursue whatever goals you might have and make rational choices among means because they're giving you bad information. So lying, deception, those are going to be fundamentally bad things for Kant because they interfere with someone's rationality. What are some other things like that? Things that would interfere with your ability to make choices in pursuit of your own ends.
I was gonna say physically harm somebody, but
Threats, maybe?
that doesn't necessarily change. Yeah, like threatening your safety, threatening to harm someone.
That's not threat.
Good. Yes, a threat would be something that interferes with this and maybe causing certain kinds of physical harm. That's right. That's interfering with your ability. Now, there are threats that might be acceptable. For example, the professor says you must turn in this paper, and if you don't, you fail the course. That's a threat of a kind, but it's a threat that is supposed to help you attain your end in the course, right?
Well, and there's also some consent in that too, because you're
Yes.
obviously in the class.
Good, right. So consent is going to be crucial, for one thing, right? I'm going to be able to do this, but only with your consent. If I just drag people off the street and say, you're in this course, you write this paper, or I'm going to fail you and get you in some kind of trouble, then, so consent is crucial, information is crucial. So interfering with somebody's consent by making a threat, by forcing somebody into something, by using physical violence, that sort of coercion is going to be fundamentally bad. What are some other ways? Are there other ways? Some people say that's it for Kant. Anything that coerces someone, without them consenting to agree to that kind of coercion, anything that interferes with information by deceiving someone, those are the two fundamentally bad things for Kant. There might be others though, yeah.
I mean, anything that would limit them, like discrimination or something that like withholds opportunity.
Okay, excellent. And that's going to bring us to one of his other principles. Yes, here's one way in which I might interfere. And it's not so much, how can I put it? It's showing disrespect for somebody's rationality. If I've got two people here who are similarly situated, and I treat them very differently by discriminating on the basis of something irrelevant to whatever we're all trying to accomplish, then I am actually either discriminating against this person and disvaluing their rationality, or maybe I'm showing favoritism to this person, but I'm still not showing equal regard for their own rational natures. He says every rational being values rational nature in and of itself. And what that means is that I've got to respect everybody's rational nature, and I've got to respect that equally. So here's another way to get back to our question of what is a good will, of showing bad will. It might be deceiving someone, it might be coercing somebody, and in those ways using that person. It might also be this kind of unequal treatment. It might be discriminating. And here he has in mind any sort of discrimination that is irrelevant to whatever we're deciding. Of course, if people apply to a job, there's certain things that are relevant to their ability to do the job. And I can think about those things. That's not using them in a bad way. But to discriminate on the basis of irrelevant things, that would be. And so he says, I may not use what he calls subjective particular determinations in reaching my decisions. What does he mean? Subjective. Well, in other words, things that apply only to me, let's say, or are not at any rate universal. And then particular, things that involve particular aspects of people that are not universal. So yes, I am, let's say, evaluating job applicants, and I look at what degrees they have, what experience they have, this type of thing. What are some things I really should not use as a basis for my decision? Because they would involve these kinds of subjective, particular determinations.
Your history with whether or not they were in the military, say.
Oh, okay, veteran status. I shouldn't be discriminating on the basis of that.
Gender.
Gender.
Whether they have children.
Whether they have children.
Age.
Age.
None of these are necessarily arbitrary.
Okay, they're not necessarily arbitrary. Let's say there could be ways in which these are actually linked, right, to what I'm looking for. So I am a casting director, and I'm looking for somebody to play a child, and a 70-year-old applies. It seems to me plausible under those circumstances to say, I'm sorry, you can't have the part of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You're a 70-year-old man. Okay, well, the gender and the age there are kind of in the way then.
He was in uniform though, he was ready.
Yeah, no, right.
What about if you're looking at their resumes and that's all you see, and you see that this one is from the University of Tennessee and this one was from Cal State, this one was from, I don't know what, Georgia, and you're like, I really hate Tennessee. So I'm not even going to consider them.
Exactly, that's the kind of thing he has in mind also with subjective particular determinations. It's not just things people do tend sometimes to discriminate on the basis of, like, well, the various things you've mentioned, veteran status, or gender, or race, or ethnicity, or the various kinds of things that we have normally encoded in law. Kant would say, yes, those things are bad unless it's tied somehow specifically to the requirements of that particular position. In the law, those are called bona fide occupational qualifications, and that's an exception to non-discrimination things. But it's also things like that. oh, I hate Tennessee, so your degree is from Tennessee, I'm going to throw your resume in the reject pile. That too would be an example of something. Now, if it's a different sort of thing, it's like, yeah, we've hired a number of people from the University of Tennessee, and man, none of them turn out to be any good. Then maybe it's rational for me to say, well, actually, I think there's something wrong with their degree program. Their people seem to do badly. Or conversely, we hire some people from one school and they all seem to do great. Then we say, oh, they must really train people well. So that's not necessarily the kind of thing. But if it really is, another team with orange. I hate teams other than Texas that have orange on their jerseys. I mean, come on. Florida, Tennessee, who else is like that? Hate them. Then that's something that would be just as bad from a moral point of view, you might say. Now, in saying just as bad, I don't mean the consequences would be just as bad. Maybe that's so particular that it's not like it causes any massive social problems if I do this. But in terms of my intentions, in terms of the moral character of that, it is actually just as bad. It is something that would also be failing to respect people's rational nature in the right way. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that Kant says would be an indication of a bad will. Well, let's stop and think about that for a moment and say, all right, so equal respect for rational nature means that I have to give people, well, equal respect. And that means if I'm judging my own intentions, or what he calls a maxim, he defines that as a subjective principle of volition. So in other words, a reason why I'm deciding, the reason that goes along with my intention. I have to think, is this something I would be willing to apply to anybody? Not just in these circumstances, this particular person, but am I willing to apply the rule there to anyone? And would I be willing to have everybody use that rule? So, the very first principle he gives, the very first version of this principle he gives, is called the formula of universal law. And it says, act only on that maxim, that intention, that reason, that you could at the same time will to be a universal law. So, in short, you have to be willing to universalize your principle of action. You have to be willing to live under that as a sort of rule that everyone would follow. Would you, as a rational being, be willing to do it? It's crucial to remember here, he's not saying, think about the consequences, would it be good for you or bad for you? He is saying, could you, as a rational being, will it? Could any rational being will the universalization of that maxim? And that's a sort of tricky test. I tend to think what Kant is doing in giving us lots of versions of this principle is he's giving us a theoretical answer to the question of what makes a right action right and a wrong action wrong. And he's also giving us a practical test. This one, act only on that maxim you can at the same time will be a universal law. That's something that I think is his theoretical answer. A good will is one that acts on the basis of principle, a principle that it's willing to apply universally. And that's really the core of the idea. But admittedly, that's going to be hard to think about, as we'll see. And so it's much easier to actually have a principle you can use day to day, which is respect people, don't use them. Treat them as ends in themselves, never as means only. That's sort of the practical thing to carry around in your wallet. But the deep theoretical answer is you've got to act on maxims you can universalize. So what's an example of something you could not universalize that would be an immoral action? He doesn't give this example, but I think it's really helpful to understand it. Stealing. What's wrong with stealing? Kant would say, well, think about the maxim of your action. You're taking something of someone else's without their consent for your own benefit. And now, would you be willing, as a rational being, to have everybody act according to the same principle? Basically, it would be a world where everyone could take something that would benefit them without consent. Would a rational being be willing to live in such a world?
No.
No. Now, why not?
It'd be pretty chaotic.
It would be chaotic, for sure, right? What else would be wrong?
It would lead to a breakdown of, I would think it would lead to just a spiral, a breakdown of every other norm. I mean, if you're always, if it's just a never ending, say, you know, taking from, I mean, you're bound to have the other person or persons, you know, object to that.
Oh, okay, good.
Or
Now-
are you saying like it's already assumed that it's okay for everyone?
No,
So nobody would object?
No, no. I mean, you're right, absolutely. I mean, are people going to be upset about this? Almost certainly yes, right? And so, but even if we get everybody to say, yeah, what's mine is yours, what's yours is mine, and so on and so forth, Kant thinks there's going to be a problem here. And in fact, maybe a nice way to look at it is to say, yeah, are people cool with this or not? Because if they're not, you are going to get absolute chaos. You're going to get everybody taking everybody's stuff. It'll be impossible for you to count on anything, right? You bring your computer to class to take notes, and somebody says, hey, I need a computer, and grabs it. Okay? Well, there went your plan, right? It interferes with your rational nature. You now can't pursue your ends in the right way because you can't count on anything actually being respected as yours.
And that's the whole idea of the laws, right? That everyone kind of respects that these are the laws that we all have to follow because the rational beings will stop at red, go at green, you know, and do different kind of things like that, so.
Actually, that's another great example, right? Why should you stop at a red light? Kant says, well, look, suppose we had this rule that you can go through lights whenever it's convenient for you. That would be bad. That would suddenly make it pretty unpredictable what's going to happen when you approach an intersection. And so he would say that interferes with people's rationality. So yes, this will generalize to, you know, you should follow laws like that because other people are depending on your following that way, those laws, and behaving predictably. So there could be laws, let's say, that really don't involve other people at all. Maybe there's a law that says before you get dressed in the morning, you must put on one red sock and then take it off. Presumably nobody else knows if you've done it or not. That would be a crazy law, but I mean, maybe that we couldn't give the same argument there. But for most laws, you're right, we're going to be able to give that kind of argument. If I don't follow the rule, then it's going to be very hard for other people to attain their ends. There's a deeper problem in this case, Kant thinks. And here's why. It's actually nice to think about if we imagine that everybody's somehow cool with this. It's all this Woodstock thing, where it's like, yeah, we're all just sharing. Okay? And so, you want to use my computer? Fine. You know, can I have your water bottle? Sure. It's all, what do you mean, my water bottle? It's our water bottle. Right? Now, Kant would say, look, in a world like that, actually it would be just our water bottle. There'd be no such thing as property if it was okay to take whatever you want. Because what would it mean that it was your computer? What would it mean that it was your water bottle? It would actually be, these would be our computers. Those would be our water bottles, our camera, etc. And anybody could use it. Now, here's his point. In such a world, nobody could steal it. Notice, because there'd be no such thing as stealing. Stealing is taking somebody else's property, and there would be no such thing as property. So he says, actually, in such a world, it would be impossible to steal. And he thinks that's not a sign that it's a good thing. That's a sign that there's something deeper wrong with it. It's not just that a rational being wouldn't want to live in a world like this. A world like this is actually incoherent. Because that's not a world where it would be okay to steal. There would be nothing to steal, because there would be no such thing as ownership of anything. And he thinks that's the kind of thing that would indicate that stealing is immoral. Okay, so Kant's idea is in a way that if we've got this rule for ourselves and we were to universalize it and imagine everybody behaving according to the same rule, something would go wrong if the action is immoral. Either it'd be like stealing, where we imagine everyone doing it and we say, wait, there is no world where everyone steals because there's no such thing as stealing, because there's no such thing as property in such a world. Or we go to the level of what a rational being would will. Could a rational being will to live in a world like that? No, it would be too unpredictable. You couldn't pursue your own ends and count on anything, because anything you're using might disappear at any moment. And so, however you want to look at that, it's going to fail one or the other part of that test. There really are two parts. Could there be a world where everybody operates according to my maxim? And the second part is, could I as a rational being, could anybody as a rational being will to live in such a world? Or would it contradict rationality? So that part of the sort of, that version of the principle really implies that we have to act according to rules, and rules that respect rationality, rules that we're willing to universalize. So one thing is we can't discriminate, but another thing is we cannot make exceptions willy-nilly. He thinks the basic core of immorality is making an exception for yourself. The fact that this thief doesn't want to be robbed is a sign that the thief is also operating according to the rule, do not steal. They just make an exception for themselves. The murderer is not saying, murder's cool, man, it's okay for you to kill me, is instead saying, I'm making an exception for myself. I'm allowed to kill, but you aren't allowed to kill me. Now, that's going to have important implications for organizations too. So, what does it really mean about decision-making in organizations?
You have to be able to live by the maxims you're forcing on your employees or employers or coworkers or customers or.
Okay, good, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't agree with that. I think that can be a pretty good rule for morality. But just because that tells you what's morally good or morally bad doesn't mean that you need to
Yeah, I'm not
apply that to
not
like.
necessarily agreeing with it. I'm just saying that's.
Yeah, I mean, one thing it would say is you've got to act on the basis of these universal principles. And so you've got to be willing to live under them too. It doesn't mean that there can't be bosses and employees and so on, but it does mean that certain basic principles have to be applied across the board. You can't be making exceptions. You can't say, well, all right, in order to get this position, let's say you have to be in that position for 3 years before you can be considered a senior vice president, let's say. Oh, but wait, you're the boss's nephew. So, yeah, we'll waive that in your case. That would be an example of something that looks like a violation of these principles. Unless, of course, now it could be you say, well, there's actually a way of making a principled judgment here that doesn't just involve being the boss's nephew. But that gets very tricky, right? What constitutes an acceptable reason for making an exception? The most common criticism of Kant's ethics is that he can't allow you to make exceptions to rules. You've got to always follow the rules universally. And sometimes that seems wrong. We've talked about the distinction between formal and informal aspects of organizations. And you might say an advantage of the informal is that it allows you flexibility. It allows you to make certain exceptions. So, what are some cases in an organization? I mean, ethicists tend to debate the case of the Nazi at the door looking for hidden Jews. Can you tell lies to that person? But let's think about something that comes up in organizations. It's not that often that Nazis show up at the door. So let's think about things that are more commonplace. When do you think it might be morally acceptable to draw, to make an exception to some general principle? And could we explain that on Kantian grounds? Yeah.
I don't know if I can, I'll have to think about how to explain it on Kantian grounds, but since I work for a live entertainment venue, some of the things that we need to accomplish to make a show happen do not fall within university guidelines. So
Maybe we shouldn't require you to say any more, but.
Okay, for example, for example,
Yeah.
and I think I told some of you this during intensive week, I had to buy goldfish for a show.
Live or the
I had to buy live goldfish for a show. I wish it was the edible. But I can't purchase that with a state credit card because it's a live animal as an actual like byline. And then I also couldn't use like state funds to purchase it. So then I had to go so it just kind of like kept growing and growing and growing as to how complicated it was for me to buy like $6 worth of goldfish. Eventually it came down to accounting was like, oh, well, it's in the contract that you've agreed to provide this for this particular person, so I guess we'll let you buy it.
Why couldn't you just buy it and get reimbursed with your own card?
Same thing.
Because the state's
Still funds.
paying me the money back. The state's still paying
Still
for
state
it.
funds.
Well, I do that all the time in our office.
Stop talking, Teddy.
Like that example, I eventually found the moral way to do it per the
Right.
university, but sometimes it's not
Yeah.
as straightforward.
Right.
There isn't a solution.
Now notice there, somebody actually said, maybe we can fit this under a principle. It was
exception.
promised in the contract,
That's
right?
right.
So one way, and I think in general Kant can allow for exceptions, telling lies under certain circumstances and so on. But it has to be an exception for a principled reason. like, oh, well, this violates that guideline, but you've already agreed to it in the contract, so okay. We're doing it for that reason. We're not just saying, all right, exception. Other kinds of cases,
How
yeah.
about under a bid process, you're required to get 3 bids, and you know that somebody can come in and low bid it, and you know that they may not be able to live up to the standards of what's required to get it done, but you know the person who may be a little bit more expensive will do it.
Right. Ah, okay, good. Yeah, maybe you're required by the rule to take the low bid, and yet in this case you know the low bidder is unlikely to be able to actually complete the task or won't do it very well. That might be a case where you want to make an exception to the rule, right? Other cases, yeah.
When you do something like that, I don't know that, because we have that a lot in our business, they have to open bid certain contracts. We're the only ones in the area who have the licenses to do it. And you have Joe Blow down the street going, I'll do it for $3.
Ah, right.
And, you know, they have to open it up, they have to do it, but there is absolutely categorical, they are not permitted to handle anything. So like, it's hard, but, I mean, it just makes unnecessary hoop jumping.
Right. Well, good. Now, it might be possible in some of these cases to actually say, here's a principled reason. That person doesn't have the required licenses, or this person doesn't have that, and so on and so forth. But even given all of that, it might be there are cases where you really get the sense that, look, I don't know how to write a rule that says that you ought to make exceptions in this kind of case, but I'm telling you, I know these people, and this person is not trustworthy, and that one is, or that type of thing. And so, there are situations in an organization, it seems to me, where you want to be able to make exceptions. Now, there are a lot of cases, though, where you don't, where there really is a power to the Kantian argument that you should be deciding on the basis of principle, and you should be applying those principles evenly to everybody. So what are some places where you really want to say, no, this should be formal, this really should be universally applied and fairly applied? And there's a danger here of people showing favoritism or discrimination or whatever to deviate from that.
Maybe a training for a specific job. So we have brazers in our work, and they have to go through a very specific, pretty rigorous training in order to be a brazer. So to not go through this training could impact quality or everything else like that, and not everybody going through the training ends up being a brazer because there are certain skills that they have to achieve before that happens.
Ah, okay, good. You might say, look, you have to actually have gone through this sort of thing in order to do this, and we feel uncomfortable making an exception for that. Yeah.
Well, like maybe, so I work at a charter school and it's a lottery system, so you have, everyone applies in a lottery, and then, you know, their names are just pulled randomly for however many spots. But then if you like need to call more people, say from, you know, the waiting list, to be like, they had a child here 2 years ago, I don't want to call them. I mean, like, you know, so there's some, but you have to.
Right.
You know, I mean, it would it would be interfering with their opportunity. It would be interfering with showing favoritism over or discriminating against them, just not following those rules. That would be a breakdown in the system altogether.
Ah, okay, yes, right. There are times when we really value the system. We want that universality, partly because we think there is a real danger of a breakdown. You make one exception and other exceptions start following, right? Yeah.
Organizations' code of ethics and conduct.
Right, good.
It's the most obvious.
Exactly. Lots of organizations have codes of conduct. And why do they bother to write it down in a code? Because of Kantian types of considerations. They want everybody following the same rules, and they think it's important to act on the basis of principles. Now, there might be situations where an individual's judgment actually conflicts with that rule, but the code is there partly to say, look, these are the principles we're supposed to be following, and you might say, in general, it is better. We're going to discuss this issue some next time, because what do you do in a case where it really feels like the code constrains you? Like the benefit of breaking the rule here is so great, you feel like you ought to break the rule. I think that's a hard question, and I'm not going to pursue it today, but I want you to think about it for next time, because John Stuart Mill has a very interesting answer to this kind of puzzle, both why we want rules, but also why we want sometimes to break them, and what we ought to do about that case where we're tempted to break the rule for the greater good. But for now, I'm going to put that issue aside a little bit. And, well, one more thing on Kant. there's an implication I want to draw out of this. The last formulation he gives of the categorical imperative, this one rule, is one based on the kingdom of ends. He has this concept of a kingdom of ends, a circumstance where everybody is treating everyone else as an end to themselves. Nobody's using anyone else as a mere means. And in that world, he says, there's a systematic union of ends. Now, some people take this in a way of as a way of saying that really we should decide as if we're legislators in some utopia. He says, act as a legislating member of the kingdom of ends, as if you're part of the legislature making universal rules for this kingdom of ends. And you might think, well, wait a minute. I don't get it, because in the kingdom of ends, nobody's using anybody else as a mere means, so nobody's committing crimes, for example. So suppose my job is the head of a prison system. Hey, in the kingdom of ends, we wouldn't need any jails because nobody would be doing anything immoral, so let's just close down all the jails. You might think there's something really utopian in a bad way about all of this. But I think actually, when you think about this from the point of view of organizational ethics, there's something really useful. Because even if society at large is not a kingdom of ends, and even if it is not a place where there is a systematic union of ends, nevertheless, within an organization, you might say, there really is, to some degree anyway, a systematic union of ends. People band together as members of this organization for a purpose, to achieve certain goals. So they not only have the kind of common ends that we all have as rational beings, namely rationality and the ability of people to attain their goals by choosing means, but also whatever the purpose of the organization is. And that does provide a systematic union of ends. So we can think, all right, an organization is really something like one of these little kingdoms, ideally, and you can think that in my behavior, I should be acting as if I'm making universal rules for the organization. So imagine that in my behavior as an employee or a member, I am actually setting a rule that everyone has to behave the way I'm behaving. How would that change anybody's attitude about being a member of the organization? Saying, I'm going to act so that, I imagine everybody having to follow my example and do just what I'm doing.
Unifying?
Say it again?
Unifying?
Okay, it is supposed to unify, right, exactly. In a sense, I think he thinks if everybody thinks this way, it does help to promote a systematic union of ends. Because one thing I'll be doing is thinking, I better pursue those systematic ends that we all share, and not just pursuing my own ends, especially if they conflict with those. I think, yes, suppose I am putting my own ends over the ends of the organization and actually harming the achievement of those ends. Wait, if everyone were to do that, if that were the rule, the organization would fall apart. And so whatever might happen in the sort of tricky, sort of general version of Kant's theory, here we can say, yeah, if everyone were to do this, that better be consistent with that systematic union that constitutes our organization. But let's think about a practical case. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry.
No, please, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, communism, right?
Okay, good. There is one interpretation of the systematic union of ends business that really does lead you to either fascism or communism. And there are Kant scholars who advocate that. And indeed, I think Marxists as well as fascists have been inspired by this. When Hitler, in the Munich beer hall putsch, was jailed, what did he do? He read, among other things, Kant. And in fact, Kingdom of Ends, what's the German? Reich der Zweck. Okay, I'm not so fond of this anymore. But Marxists were also inspired by it. In fact, Marx would say, yes, the fundamental evil here is exploitation. And so people must not exploit one another. And he has his own particular interpretation of what a systematic union of ends is, and what a communist society would be like, and what exploitation and using someone is, and so on. So there are lots of things, and lots of bad things that can come out of Kant here. And indeed, if we thought, we must act to promote a systematic union of ends, I can see your ends are not those of us. This, I'm sounding like Arnold Schwarzenegger here. But anyway, that's something that you might say would take this in a very bad direction. And yet, I think there is an aspect I think that's not what Kant meant. I think he meant that, first of all, we should respect the ends we all share. As rational beings, we all share that end of rationality. But in addition, in particular, let's say within a family, we actually do share a lot more than just that, right? So strangers might not share anything more than this question of generally what rational beings all share. But within a family, we share a lot more than that. We share a concern for the welfare of the family. Within a business, we're concerned with the welfare of the business. Within a university, we're concerned with the welfare of the university and other things that stem from the purposes of that organization. And so we shouldn't make sure only that our actions are consistent with rationality. We should make sure they're consistent with the aims of that organization. So as a professor, for example, I shouldn't do things that are actually going to interfere with the goal of the university. Let's say that's education. Or within the business, maybe it's attaining profits. I shouldn't do things that are going to interfere with that goal. Within our little Audubon society, it might be watching lots of birds. I shouldn't do things that are going to interfere with our goal of watching birds, and so forth. And so I think there's a sort of global interpretation of Kant that can lead in some very nasty directions. I prefer a local interpretation of this. I think he's really saying, well, it does. In a way, Confucius is right. It depends on certain social roles that I play, an organization I'm a part of. What ends do we share? That helps to govern the rules that ought to control our behavior, constrain our behavior toward one another. Yeah.
I think it's pretty telling that Kant wrote explicitly on politics and he was like a pretty individualist.
Oh, exactly. Kant did not himself mean it in those direct ways at all. He was an individualist. He was a supporter of liberal democracy. I think he would have been appalled at the way that fascists and communists took his thought. So, yeah, I mean, he is somebody who views himself quite properly as a thinker in the Enlightenment tradition. He's a social contract theorist. A lot of his political philosophy looks very much like that of John Locke. Yeah, so I don't think he intended that sort of global thing at all. I think he intended this much more local thing. I think it's weird that actually most contemporary commentators read him in this sort of global, from my point of view, very weird way that actually would conflict with most of his political philosophy. I think it's meant to be coherent with that, and it's really intended all the way along to be this more local consideration. So that's a very good point. In fact, there's a wonderful work of his on political philosophy and international affairs. It's on called Perpetual Peace. It's very short. I highly recommend it. It's a nice way of thinking about those kinds of problems. And very few people in the history of philosophy think about those international type of questions. But Kant does in a way that's both consistent with this and I think surprisingly insightful.